Hi, good morning, everyone here in person and those of you who are watching us from your offices or virtual um, perches. I am Dhanani Ganguly. I direct the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures. And I have to acknowledge this astonishing moment where we are actually, for the very first time, meeting for a public seminar in person since March 2020. The Institute has, of course, been active during this period, but we have run every program and every talk and every seminar on Zoom these past 2.5 years. So I do want to acknowledge this moment, and also with the hope that we can have a more in-person interaction as the world begins to heal. So welcome everyone. Before I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers today, for those of you who are not familiar with this particular talk series, the Institute hosted a 5-year faculty fellowship program funded by the Mellon Foundation from 2016 to 2021. And during that period, we hosted about 50 faculty fellows, about 10 fellows every year. And once Mellon Foundation, our funding from the Mellon Foundation came to an end, our institute was, curious to say, we reached out to our fellows and asked them about the progress with the work that they were doing when they were with us, and to send us a list of publications or other kinds of outcomes that came from their fellowship. And we were astonished that out of the 50 faculty fellows, between them published 27 monographs since their fellowship. It was just an astonishingly productive kind of stock take that we had the pleasure of doing. So then our program committee had the idea that why not continue to run seminars with our Mellon Fellows, where we get an opportunity to showcase, what was that? It's just something. Serious monographs and that's it. Okay. So that we get an opportunity to congratulate our authors and also hear about their books, hear them talk about their publications. So we ran a series last year, and we are delighted to continue the series this academic year. And something about the book series that is running in this semester, we'll have 3 speakers this semester, starting with Professor Shankar Nair. And the interesting thing about our 3 speakers is all of them work in medieval and early modern cultures, studies across the world. So Shankar broadly focused on South Asia, but across other language worlds that extend up to West Asia, or what we call the Middle East today. Then another speaker, Amanda Phillips, will be presenting her work. She's a specialist of Ottoman Empire and art historian who works with textiles and art of that period. And we have her talk in October. And then our final speaker this semester is Ricardo Padron, professor of Spanish, who specializes in early modern Spanish cultures across the globe. And his particular focus is the Spanish East Indies. So we have a set of really 3 exciting talks this semester. And I now turn to our first speaker in the Mellon book series this morning, Shankar Nair, who's associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies here at the University of Virginia. Shankar held a Mellon Fellowship with our institute about 4 years ago. And we heard him share his work in progress and give some amazing, at least one astonishingly rich talk, an hour-long talk that I still remember, and I have, been actively my notes are still there, and I keep going back to. I will always remember one of the things you said during your talk when you were parsing a particular philosopher. We were talking about nuanced philosophy, or no? I'm getting it wrong. But the one phrase that I took away was how you think of the universal as the maximalization of the particulars. And it has stayed with me in over these years. So recently, Shankar published his book from the University of California Press, Translating Wisdom, Hindu-Muslim Intellectual Traditions in Early Modern South Asia, and we're going to hear more about the book today. Shankar's research interests include Sufism and Islamic philosophy, Quranic exegesis, Hindu philosophy and theology, Muslim-Hindu interaction in South Asia, Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit literatures, and South Asian religions. So welcome, Shankar, to our series. Shankar will be joined by our guest discussant, respondent, and an interlocutor with Shankar's work, Lynna Dhanani, who's assistant professor in religious studies at the University of California, Davis. Her research explores the confluence of interreligious polemics, philosophical debate, devotional themes, and poetics in the Sanskrit hymns of the celebrated 12th century Shvetambara Jain Hemachandra, court pundit to two Hindu kings of medieval Gujarat. Lynna has a wide range of interests, including Jainism, Sanskrit, and Prakrit languages and literature, medieval Indian alchemical traditions, that's fascinating, yoga and tantra, Indian devotional movements, Indian philosophy, and especially South Asian religious art. So here's the format for the seminar. Shankar will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and then we will hear Lynna respond to the book and share her thoughts about Shankar's work, and then there will be a conversation between the two and with us. So please welcome Shankar and Lynna.
Thanks so much, Dhanani, for that very kind introduction. Sincerest thanks to the IHGC and Joseph, all the other administrators that I may know, and to all of my fellows who's finished sparkling books. I look forward to discussing in future book talks in this series. My book simply wouldn't have been possible, honestly, without the time that I spent here as a Mellon Fellow. I'm honored that you would use your first in-person event in 2 years on my book. And to me, in thinking about my trajectory that led up to this book, this space really was such an important one. And I'm so grateful to be able to have it again in person. Innocuous little conversations, a book reference here, an author reference there. So much of that ended up in the book, giving me shape, giving me direction, giving me a lens. And so it's really just heartwarming, I'll say, to be back here now with the book Translating Wisdom finally out. My sincerest thanks also to Professor Lynna Dhanani for generously engaging my work, traveling all this way from California to discuss it with me. I really look forward to our conversation today and to learning from your keen insights. I'll try to keep it shorter than 40 minutes. I hope for more of a conversation if possible. But in the short time I have now, I'll try to give a little overview about just a few things I set out to accomplish in the book, particularly dimensions of the book that are, I think, speak to the broader humanities. There's plenty in the book that's caught in the weeds, the particularities of Islamic and Hindu scholastic traditions. I'm looking forward to talking about those nitty-gritties with Lynna. But for this part here, I'll try to keep things a little bit broader, because I do endeavor to make certain interventions that I think are relevant to the broader humanities as a whole. In particular, I aimed to address the frequent call to diversify the humanities, make it a more pluralistic space. Wondering, frankly, what does this even mean? What does it mean to diversify humanities? In particular, there's a frequent call, and I'll admit, for me, these are the most exciting calls, to diversify in a way where we, quote, learn from the other, or we, quote, take the other, capital O, seriously. Trying to think beyond the Euro-American canon. But while these calls are frequent, I haven't really deduced any consensus on concrete steps for doing so. And so in this book, I do try to ask at a broad level, how? How do we learn from the other? How do we engage the other? What would such a development look like within a modern Europhone academy? In brief, my own perception is that the calls for such diversification, well, I won't get ahead of myself. But basically in this book, I seek to learn from a historical case study, a case of two intellectual traditions, an Arabo-Persian intellectual philosophical tradition and a Sanskritic one, primarily Hindu in the case of this book, which, at least in their formative years, were almost entirely isolated from one. In other words, the terms of their two discourses, the basic questions they asked, their basic vocabulary, their basic terminology, their basic assumptions, formed in isolation from one another. And then as mature intellectual traditions, these two traditions met. And as I try to detail in the book, I try to reconstruct the process through which these mature, fully formed intellectual traditions found a way to craft a dialogue with one another. How did they find the language to communicate, to render one another visible? And in what ways were they talking past each other and perhaps misunderstanding one another? And part of the reason I make this move is because many of the calls to, quote, learn from the other in humanities will adopt a model of taking a thinker and then analyzing that thinker comprehensively, and then trying to have a conversation with that thinker, which is great, which is fantastic. I'm all for it. I'd love to see more of it. But what I was hoping to add to the mix with this book is to actually look at their own process in 16th, 17th century South Asia of crafting this dialogue. Can we learn from their process, right? The practical tools that they took to forge a language of communication? Could we do our own version of something like that in the humanities today? So in other words, I'm interested not only in the content of these thinkers' writings, but also in their process of dialogue formation. First, a quick glimpse at the state of the study of pre-modern South Asian, mostly Islam, but also Hinduism, in the North American Academy, just to give a bit of context for my intervention. There's, of course, a pronounced investment in modern day South Asian studies to correct nationalist historiography. The sorts of nationalist narratives that have been coming out of Pakistan and India over the past century or so, with, of course, increasingly dire stakes, just if you read the news today. In these nationalist narratives, Hinduism and Islam are discrete, essentialized entities that are fundamentally and eternally opposed and hostile to one another. Nearly all of Indo-Islamic history is explained in terms of this dichotomy, a trajectory toward, quote, tolerance, liberalism, pluralism. These trajectories are identified with figures like the Mughal Emperor Akbar or Prince Dar Shikoh. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the forces of, quote, bigotry or orthodoxy. And usually these are tags to figures like Emperor Aurangzeb. These figures are, of course, all proxies for basically a supposedly secular India and a supposedly Islamic Pakistan. So for all of South Asian history, projected through the lens of the binary partition. This nationalist narrative is, of course, deeply refracted through a colonial legacy. For instance, the very conceptualization of a, quote, orthodox Islam as being inherently dry, legalistic, zealous, intolerant, bloodthirsty for conquest. These are, of course, colonial discourses that have been imbibed by the so-called natives. And so modern day South Asian studies tends to be very preoccupied with the problem of projecting such modern categories and realities back problematically, incorrectly, into the pre-modern past. Reading the past, in other words, through the lens of our contemporary situation. The correctives that we see in modern day South Asian studies in Europe and America, to be brief to a fault, go too far to the other extreme. Nationalist narratives attempt to explain everything in terms of religion, right? A problematic colonial notion of religion. And so in response, what we find modern day South Asian studies looking for any other possible way of explaining it, right? Let's avoid essentialized religious categories and focus instead on historical processes that are shaped by history. So instead of focusing on religion, let's focus on the political, the social, the everyday quotidian, the everyday, right, contexts and dynamics that we have habitually called Hindu-Muslim interactions, maybe religion actually has nothing to do with it. We see important correctives. I won't list all the names, but it would be something akin to, say, an American Muslim college student today using the word God to describe Allah. Through an exclusively religious lens, we might look for some sort of grand theological moment here. No, right? This is just a person speaking in their mother tongue, English, getting comfortable using an English term God to describe a notion like Allah. Most prominently, we find modern-day South Asian studies pointing to imperial motivations. Right? It's really far more primarily about politics and rulership, not so much about religion or theology. How else to explain a Hindu king supposedly beleaguered under the threat of a hostile Muslim presence, at least according to nationalist historiography, and yet such a Hindu king willingly patronizes the construction of mosques within his territory. Scholars will point to such tensions and dynamics to provide an explanation that involves anything but religion. Again, I'm over-exaggerating, but in the interest of time, that's the best that I can do. So for my book, I try to pursue more of a middle ground. To do so, I take up the example of Persian translations of Sanskrit texts, which were patronized and facilitated by the Mughals, at least described as a Muslim empire. Modern-day scholarship has tended to depict these translation moments, right, the translation of Sanskrit text to Persian, in terms of imperial authority, sort of construction of political authority. For instance, the literary motif that we find in these translations of a prince on a spiritual quest under the guidance of an ascetic sheikh or holy man. This becomes an increasingly standard feature of Mughal royal self-fashioning. Prince Dar Shikoh or Emperor Akbar will project themselves in the model of this literary motif of the saint, pursuing courtly virtues and ideals. There's also, scholars will also cite motivations of crafting of cosmopolitan courtly culture. Right? How do you project an Islamic empire in an overwhelmingly non-Muslim environment of South Asia? You need to legitimize the empire. And so such translations of Sanskrit texts to Persian are a legitimizing to render themselves acceptable to their non-Muslim subjects. Again, my intervention is to try to bring some conception of religion back into the picture. Not, of course, a flat notion of religion that would typify colonial and nationalist discourses, but one that tries, as best as possible, with many, many, many caveats, trying to be attentive to pre-modern texts and materials in their own terms. Only in passing does the field of South Asian studies seek to address some kind of an Islamic or Hindu religious quest, right? A search for philosophical truth or salvation. Right? Rarely do such motivations appear prominently. Maybe they're mentioned in passing. But in my view, a great many pre-modern South Asian Muslim actors take such notions very seriously. And I would propose that for at least a number of these agents, these are the sorts of things that are the core motivations for what they do, what they write, and what they say. So in this book, I try to give some voice to those voices. And in doing so, let me at last turn to the fascinating text that forms the central object of analysis in my book. Could we pull up the PowerPoint? Thanks so much. So during the height of the Muslim Empire in South Asia, 16th and 17th century CE roughly, as I said, Muslim nobles patronized and facilitated the translation of numerous Hindu Sanskrit texts into the Persian language. Numerous Sanskrit texts were chosen for translation, including the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, especially the Bhagavad Gita, several Vedas and Upanishads, among numerous others. Typically, these translations were accomplished by teams of Persian-speaking Muslim court scholars on the one hand, and then Sanskrit pundits on the other, often hailing from such great centers of Sanskrit learning as Benares. So, slide. Thank you. Oh, sorry, one more. So in the book, I try to turn attention to one particular Mughal site of translation, namely the 1597 Persian rendition of the Sanskrit Yoga-Vasistha. The Yoga-Vasistha was a text that the Mughals had translated numerous times. There were at least 10 or 11 versions or renditions or retellings of this text in Persian that were produced during the Mughal period. The translation I look at was completed in 1597. So here's a brief overview of textual history. We have the original Sanskrit Yoga-Vasistha, composed by one Gauda Abhinanda, probably in the 10th century. The Yoga-Vasistha itself has a very complicated textual history that predates it, but I won't go into that here. There are numerous Sanskrit commentaries. For example, the Vasistha Chandrika of Atmasukha, just one among many. I only mention the commentaries because it's clear that the commentaries were somehow present in the room, so to speak, when this text was being translated into Persian. And the commentaries were a lens that the translators were clearly making use of. And then we finally get the complete Persian translation, known as the Yoga-Vasistha, which is simply a Persianized pronunciation of Yoga-Vasistha, which was composed by 3 scholars working in tandem, the Muslim scholar Nizamuddin Panipati, and then 2 Sanskrit pundits, Jagannatha Mishra Banarasi and Patan Mishra Jajapur. And it was completed again in 1597. In order to make this translation work, the 3 translators, Panipati especially, had to stretch and bend the Persian language in such a way that it could accept an influx of a tremendous volume of new vocabulary, whose roots lay in a quite foreign source, namely Sanskrit and its literary and conceptual worlds. As a result, nearly every page of the Yoga-Vasistha contains numerous Sanskrit terms transliterated into Persian, often quite awkwardly, terms that were relevant to an extremely wide range of topics. There's tip of the iceberg, terms such as puja, that is the term for a certain form of ritual prayer, various Hindu gods and goddesses, right? Vishnu, Shiva, Saraswati, etc. Different terms for different yogic and breathing exercises, Hindu eschatological terms, notions of reincarnation, etc., and many, many, many more, peppering nearly every page of the manuscripts. The 3 translators naturally had to find a way to make each Sanskrit term comprehensible to a Persian reader, often by means of a single or multiple word definition, or by means of illustrative analogies or metaphors. These metaphors were typically borrowed from the Quran, from the tradition of Persian Sufi poetry, sometimes from the Yoga-Vasistha itself, or else from the broader Sanskrit intellectual tradition. One thinks, for example, of the famous Advaita Vedantic metaphor of the rope and the snake. Comprehensibility could also be accomplished by means of correlating the Sanskrit term in question with apparently similar Quranic or Islamic technical terms. So Brahman, for example, a Sanskrit term for absolute reality, might become Allah, or might become a more technical Islamic philosophical term like Wujude Mutlaq, absolute being. I should add here just a frustrating part of the archive that we have no access to. We have descriptions of how these translators work together, not just for this text, but for most of the translations. And they usually communicated in Hindi vernacular, North Indian vernacular. So that was the language in which they were speaking to one another. We, of course, have no record of that conversation. So we have the Sanskrit original, the Persian final product, and then we just have to try to intuit the conversation in the middle. I spent many, many hours pulling my hair out trying to reconstruct. Okay, I was going to go to the next slide. I was going to go over just a small section of text, but I think your question might be to it. So maybe I'll do that on the slide. Maybe you can just go one more slide and I'll let you all look at that for a moment if you want to. This is from the introduction of the text, the opening pages, where the translators are framing, in a way, their approach. And then you can see all over the page, I'll give some context to all these technical terms in the Q&A. But you can see how the translators, presumably Panipati primarily, are drawing from various facets of Islamic philosophy, Sufi technical terminology, etc., to craft a kind of vision of religious diversity from the long history of Islamic cultural history. That's providing the lens through which this translation is justified and through which their translation choices are filtered. So more on this slide later today. So let me try to finish up. What time are we at now? Oh, yeah, I want to get to this. A few broader features, again, coming out of the weeds a bit, a few broader features of the way that I frame this book and ways that I think this otherwise specialist material, ways I would want it to speak to the broader humanities. You're going to ask me later about a pervasive metaphor that frames the book, the metaphor of jet streams. In short, I tried to deploy this metaphor of jet streams. There were other options, terms like currents. Of course, the go-to term nowadays in the humanities is probably discourse, right? In the Foucauldian sense. There are various reasons that I felt the need to innovate a new metaphor, a newish metaphor of jet streams to characterize these two traditions, again, the Sanskritic intellectual tradition and the Arabo-Persian, that really had a definitive, concrete shape of their own, surprising endurance. We're talking about traditions that have been in continuous conversation for 1,000 years or more, and yet weren't reified, had the ability to be dynamic, to shift, to adjust to different contexts. And I continue to extend the metaphor by suggesting that there are wisps, little wisps of air that can jump out of one jet stream, jump out of the other jet stream, and sort of intermingle and form a smaller, perhaps more temporary ecology unto itself. And it's in such creative, sometimes chaotic spaces that we find translations like this. Scholars on the ground, deeply learned in these really long-standing traditions, and drawing on that long-standing tradition to do something very creative, very experimental. Towards the end of the book, I characterize it as something akin to an interdepartmental colloquium. How do you get a scholar of English to talk to an economist, right? It's going to be a lot of work. Usually we don't, right? Yeah, usually such colloquial fail. But sometimes it might catch. And I do think this was one that the textual record shows us really was catching and had a life for 1-2 centuries. And then for various reasons, colonialism being one of them, the conversation wasn't allowed to continue, at least not in the way it did before. And so in crafting that metaphor, I think network theory, critical discourse, etc. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. In seeking to learn from, again, the process, the historical process by which these two communities of thinkers forged a conversation, the main insight that I highlight in the book is that, you can see it right here on the page, the first priorities that they highlight, the first things that need to be straightened out in order for this conversation to happen, at least in the eyes of these translators, is you have to get your metaphysics straight. You have to get your truth claims straight. What is real? What isn't real? Epistemology is also on the page. How do we know? How do we know what we know? But really, it's metaphysics. That's their starting. I don't think that's something we tend to do. That's not our starting impulse in the modern day humanities, by and large. Again, we'll talk more about it in Q&A, I think. But that disconnect and those different intuitions, so to speak, I think looking at how they crafted their dialogue, we have an awful lot to learn in the modern day humanities. For now, I'll just say in brief that most calls for the diversification of humanities, in my view, they do fall under a Eurocentric umbrella, a Eurocentric notion of liberal pluralism, secularism, and we often underappreciate the ways that what will appear to us as often a neutral space is not, in fact, felt as neutral by a great many of the people that we would seek to have dialogue with until then. I think we are more attuned than ever, thankfully, in the modern day humanities, to be attuned to our political assumptions, right? The political presuppositions that we're bringing to a given moment of cross-cultural dialogue. But I would learn a lesson from these translators that we need to be attuned not only to our politics, but also to our metaphysics. And the space that might look neutral in terms of truth claims may in fact not be so. Okay. And so, yeah, in the conclusion of the book, and I'll finish up with this, I just run with this train of thought for a while, try to look through different possibilities, different downfalls, but it is sort of trying to critique and find a way around this kind of liberal umbrella, the neoliberal umbrella that is usually presumed by most of our pitches for how to do interreligious dialogue or cross-cultural dialogue. Perhaps we could do it differently, learning lessons from these thinkers, again, such as focusing on metaphysics. Very last thing I'll say is trying to take the lead from these translators here. Two broad possibilities that I could imagine. One of them I can imagine much more clearly, the other one I cannot, but I would love to throw it out to you in the Q&A. These figures are at one level clearly leaning on a language of philosophy, leaning on a language of technical, philosophical, or theological vocabulary, again, getting your metaphysics straight, in a discursive sense. One could imagine a role for a kind of philosophy of religion, bringing that more prominently into the humanities at large, but in ways that would question the current paradigms of how philosophy is done, right? Philosophy would have to stretch and bend in order to accommodate traditions like these, be open to alternative forms of rationality, alternative ways of knowing, etc. But then we also raise the danger of the mode that you're pursuing is a philosophical one. Well, then you have to be willing to not only learn from the other, but also critique the other. There can't be a knee-jerk inclusivism. The legacies of colonialism perdure. I'm not so sure that that's the way to go, right? As much as I might want to critique a liberal impulse to suspend judgment, it does serve a good role in light of enduring utterly imbalanced power dynamics that still typify our world today. But a second possibility that these texts suggest to me is dialogue through a mode of literature, through a mode of imagination, right? The scholars who I look to, contemporaneous with this time period, to try to decipher this text, they're all hardcore rational philosophers most of the time in their day jobs. When they're just writing a text to their guild, right, to their department, so to speak, to their ivory tower, they write in an incredibly dense, specialist, argumentative, dialectical mode. So they all are card-carrying philosophers in a rigorous rational sense. When it comes to engaging the other, so to speak, in the Mughal context, they completely depart from that mode. It's a big difference from, say, the Greco-Arabica, the Greek translation, much earlier in the history of Islam, when the full corpus of Greek science, medicine, philosophy, etc., is being translated. There, it's a very technical, argumentative, rationalistic vocabulary. Couldn't be more different in the Mughal. Here, it's literature that interests them. It's stories, it's narrative, it's poetry. And so all these card-carrying philosophers, when they're engaging in a project like this, their mode is much more literary, is much more imaginative. Not an imagination in the sort of J.Z. Smith sense, like bigger in religious studies and beyond. Imagination that exists only in the scholar's mind, exists only in the scholar's study. The notions of imagination that we're finding these scholars use is an imagination that tracks onto the real. It's imagination that helps us to access what is true. Again, metaphysics is a core part of their concern. Trying to pursue conversation and cross-cultural dialogue, a learning from the other in such an imaginative mode, I have a hard time thinking what that might look like in our academy today. But again, I seek very earnestly to learn from these figures. And so I feel the need to keep thinking about it and to try to keep the call. Maybe you all can help me to find a path forward to the next book. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shankar. That was a great overview. And it seems for this type of book, we need several kinds of overviews. Because upon reading the book and thinking about it further, one can easily get overwhelmed by the quantity of material, the diversity of characters in the story, the acts of translation that are not only in the attempt to translate a Sanskrit text to Persian, but then in Shankar's attempt to translate this really interesting moment in time to all of us. And so a lot of my questions come from thinking through this in different ways. And I think your book requires us to think about many different things at once. And that overall, yeah, sure. Overall, you do a very good job of distilling the time and space in which these thinkers were working, the different components of translation, the larger aspects that are at stake for us today, thinking about an event occurring a couple hundred years ago, many years ago, and what that means for us, and how we as modern scholars can take these ideas that come from modern concepts. So first, I would like to say, so I have a lot of sort of comments, and I think thanks to your overview, I can sort of jump into a commentary and questions about particulars, sort of starting from the beginning to the end. Although one of my major questions have to do with some of the comments you had at the end about how this kind of cross-cultural studies can benefit religious studies as a discipline, and where we have to go from there and what's been discussed so far. But I also want to say that as a scholar of Jainism and South Asian religions generally, I saw similar things in my own studies, whether it was courtly interactions of different religiously oriented figures, the production of texts in primary technical languages that are disseminated in vernacular languages, what that meant to these different audiences that were participating. And then I was also encouraged at the end, as you called us, to take seriously an engagement, or calling us to think about the necessity to engage with non-Western activities, to do so critically. What it might mean to apply a larger South Asian philosophical idea, to this whole discourse of philosophical inquiry and translation. So, so I would like to say at the outset, as a scholar of Jainism, I have always been influenced by the idea of which ultimately means that, well, metaphysically, that Jina, Jainism, is the omniscient figure, all knowledge. But those who do not have it have partial knowledge. But we are able to obtain greater knowledge by considering an object or a concept from different points of view. And so the Jains over time developed this concept of looking at an object, material or conceptual, from different points of view. Also formed two systems of philosophy to support that. One was the Nyas, Nyayavada, which says that you can understand something looking at different partial views, and if you collect these partial views, you have a better sense of the object. And the other is Syadvada, that contradictory characteristics can exist in one thing. And so something can exist or not exist, can both exist and not exist. And it can exist, not exist, and both exist and not exist at the same time. And so through this philosophical exploration, we are saved from our limitations, conceptual, cognitive, historical, otherwise. And so I wonder if somewhere in this, a book that deals with interactions of Hindus and Muslims, where there's a space for a Jain epistemology that would allow us to think about translation as an object, which you so thoroughly in the book, or religious dialogue. And I think it's hard for me, I think it's hard for anyone. I think your book requires multiple things because it's so rich. And so some of the questions I'd like to ask you is sort of, you know, maybe help us all to dive into the particularities of the book. So your book calls for us to understand this incredibly deep moment in history, where Hindu and Muslim philosophers came together in ways to translate the Sanskrit Sapiential into a Persian technical vocabulary of Islamic philosophy. Your book is as hybrid as the texts and historical figures you endeavor to study. It charts precise text, context, and translation. You're asked to look back in time to describe what led to this particular moment in the 16th and 17th centuries. In outlining the main characters of your book, both textual and human, can you describe the past that led to the present of your study? And why it is so important to understand. And again, this question arises as someone focused on humanism. As you do explicitly said in the book that there is an over millennia, possibly 2 millennia worth of technical development. So, sort of like an elevator pitch of why it was so important to have those beginning chapters and to show that this moment was capturing already a highly complex development. Even before we can get to the act of translation, even thought and also Islamic thought. So that's my first question.
Should you?
Yes, I think that we want to have interactive. Yeah.
Okay. So the first question I have 4 questions.
Yeah.
We have a really complex Sanskritic tradition, and we have philosophers really dealing with these terms. And it's coming into this era of many epistemologies. India is always a pluralistic society, and so we have these complex things. The act of translation and the types of discussions technical that are happening between different philosophers are an outcome of this past history. So I just wanted you to comment on that, whether it's your experience through that history, or just the importance of really understanding how complex history, and what we should know as readers wanting to better understand.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll start with Anekant about it. It's a big part of the reason I invited you. It's been a big source of shame and guilt in my book that the Jains aren't present. And that's a big problem. Jains were very present. Educators and Mughal princes were trained, taught by Jain tutors. The Jains were, in fact, far earlier than Hindu Munchis, the Hindu scribes. Jains were the first ones to be fully literate in Sanskrit and on top of their own. And so the Jains are routinely ignored across the field of South Asian studies. And pursuing this whole book, I couldn't put much more in there. The publisher wouldn't let me. But I knew there was this crucial part of the story that I lacked the space and frankly the expertise.
And I knew you knew that, so I'm not going to comment on all of it. I could say about that.
And so even before we get to the Google, speaking of that context, just asking about the lovely Yoga-Vasistha. So incredibly synthetic. It's this imagining synthesis different Buddhist philosophies and Madhyamika especially, Kashmiri Shaiva theology, which is itself very fertile in this context, Advaita Vedanta, Sankhya traditions, the list goes on. And I frankly don't know, I'm embarrassed to say. As someone who's been studying this text for over a decade, I don't know to what extent Jain thought is part of its constitution. This is all 9th, 10th century. This is all pre-Mughal. And so maybe these are things that I don't. But then it's fascinating to me to think how maybe on the originary side, like the formation of Sanskrit, and also on the Persian end of things, whether Jain thought, Jain technology, Jain contribution might have been part of crafting that Persian as well. I'm extremely open to the possibility. I would expect an Vedantavada to be something of great interest to certainly any of the Muslim scholars who are working on these issues. I, perhaps because of my ignorance, haven't seen concrete reference to Jain cosmology, Jain philosophy, in these texts, but I very well could. As to the history question and how I came to this study, so you're asking about my history coming to this study, or
just the importance for us, and I think you map this out in your book, the complexity of ideas. You're dealing in a moment where certain things are being transferred. Now, this is an outcome of that. Do we have to know the history of these two streams, these two jet streams, all that? What's important and what's really essential for us to know about that prior history before we get to this moment in time.
Right. Yeah. In a way, the whole book's a kind of exhaustive formative exercise in trying to make that point. Here I am taking up one text, and by the end of the book, one text, one Persian translation of the Sanskrit text, and by the end of the book, it's actually an embarrassingly small slice of that text that I've even been able to deal with, and I'm trying to illustrate in the book the kind of deep historical contextual work that is required to make sense of even that small stuff. And so I pick, forgive me for not really being clear about this in my overview, the body chapters of the book. I focus on one representative figure, one Hindu philosopher and two Muslim philosophers who were writing roughly contemporaneously at the same time that this translation was being produced. I look at their careers off in their own little silos. Right? So a Muslim philosopher who was writing 2 and 4 Muslims won't even find a reference to Sanskrit, Hindus, anything in his body. Right? This is I do a deep dive because I can fit into his writings, his treatises, his philosophical contributions. And then I try to show how, again, little wisps of his contribution end up appearing on the page of the translation. If we could open up the PowerPoint again, sorry. Yeah. So many of these technical terms here that I have bolded, manifestations, tajalliyat, the technical term from the Dhanani Sufi philosophical tradition. The names of the real Namhaya Haq, the reference to the so-called 99 divine names in Islamic thought, which gets elaborated in all sorts of ways. The reference to dhikr, remembering their chosen name much, the practice of dhikr. I try to argue that ways in which a star in his field at the time, from the who, so far as I can tell, never touched the Yoga-Vasistha, never thought about it, never referenced it. Nevertheless, he's writing, he's teaching, he's known in his circle. And the point I'm trying to sort of performatively make is that deep dive into that world required in order to shed light on these particular translations, these particular moments of translation, what the translators had, what they brought. So I picked these 3 figures. I picked 3 particular slices and bring that to bear on making sense of just a small collection of popular translation texts. I could have picked 10 more. I could have picked 20 more. Right? There's far, far more slices that are required. This vast intellectual heritage that these scholars were all trained in. And so in a way, I'm just sort of showing the tip of the iceberg. And what I think would be required to fully listen. Usually, this finally answers your question. And this is part of the reason I wanted to lean on a jet streams metaphor as opposed to something like discourse. I think there's usually an impulse. I don't want to over exaggerate, but I think it's a typical impulse to think of a given discourse, a given dominant discourse, as providing constraining. Discourses normalize themselves. They stamp out creativity and alternative ideas, right? They assert orthodoxy, which is all very true in numerous ways. What I'm trying to show here, and that's why I prefer jet streams instead of discourses, is that you have these deep, long, well-established orthodox, thoroughly orthodox scholastic discourses. And yet it's precisely that well of deep learning that makes possible this. That silo, it does put up that also tries to assert its own closed identity. But it's only because these translators had access to that deep learning that they were able to produce this very creative product.
And so I know that we're running out and like everyone.
No, it's fine.
Oh, okay. So there are several things, and I think there's one question that would add another dimension to this. And I think it's sort of focus on that are central, right, to the kind of translational enterprise between religious tradition and texts. So, for example, there are sort of key terms. You've mentioned this not only with specific figures you're talking about, and I think part of my question was how these three figures on a translation team. We don't know much about them, and you showed their names, and then we need other figures to understand what was that thing. So I sort of wanted to hear more about sussing out that connection between these figures. But before we get there, for example, translation. You're working in India with this. You're also working in dichotomy. So the Islamic world, would you do lineage of thought is what I think you focus on, central to understanding why certain concepts work. And I'm just curious because I think it is in that chapter, and I'm sorry, I was trying to find it while you're talking. Translates soul, whether it as the jiva, because there's another term for soul as John and Persian. And you make the statement that many of the Sanskrit terms that were translated into Persian were kept in the Sanskrit original, in a kind of shortened form, a Persianized form. But soul does not get translated. I mean, it does get translated to Persian. And it's very interesting for me as a South Asianist because there are debates about the relationship between the individual soul and the ultimate soul. In the Upanishads, this idea of Brahman, Atman being eventually absolutely out of Brahman. In the Jain tradition, you have the idea of the real self, the absolute tradition, the Atman, and Jiva is a particular soul. But then the Jains eventually make them on its terms. And the Buddhists are dealing with the no soul. What does that mean to have a no soul? Is it really just there's no soul, or the constructions that we perceive as soul do not exist? But it's such a fraught term, and somehow it lands in this time period, and they don't. It's as did they not want to deal with it? What did John mean in the context that rendered it perfect thing to place? Sometimes. The same goes with Brahma and Kana. So if you want to talk about this.
So to the first part, I'll start with the problem of a deep lack of knowledge of the translators. I mean, the two Hindu pundits, other than what I can presume from their names, their last names are kind of place names, but I know nothing. There's no archive. They're mentioned in passing, no biographical data, no other writings. I think this is a big part of the reason that we have avoided trying to focus on the translators, as instead focused on the patrons, who are princes and kings and those know about. And so that was a core methodological challenge. And lacking any significant biographical data about any of the three of them, especially the two Sanskrit languages. I decided to look at what I could glean in their intellectual from their translation. The terms that they're using, the text that they seem to be reading, and the imprint of relationships. That became the genesis of the method that I pursued. That's already in this book. This thinker, his last name is Dhanani, right? Educated guess that he's somehow from Benares or familiar with the Benares context. Who were the great teachers at that time? What are the theological and philosophical debates at that time? Do I see evidence of that in the translation? Jiva is precisely one of those books. Let me get back to that in a second. As to the right, so I don't know much about the two translators. I end up having to resort to those other great teachers at the time. Yes, they learned under these figures, but at the very least they've read these are standard figures that will be cited in the curriculum that you would go through at that time to become a funder. So that became the reason for choosing the criteria for choosing the three figures that I gave the main body chapters. Two of the three of them are explicitly working with the Saraswati is like the Vedanta, who's continuing a recent-ish trend of appropriating Yoga-Vasistha into Advaita Vedanta. Again, it has origins that really aren't related to Buddhist, the Kashmiri Shaiva, what have you. But this text has recently been appropriated by the Advaita tradition. Madhusudana is the great thinker of the time, who's an exeget. So he was a natural choice. If risky, so Johnny mentioned, I gave my Mellon Fellow's talk about him. He's just the coolest dude. He's so bad. He's this Iranian guy who rubbing elbows with sultans there, great lauded thinker, every aristocratic delight you could ask, and he's clearly uncomfortable with it. He walks around Iran in tattered rags and takes whatever chance he can to leave Iran and travel completely incognito around India, going into caves for years at a time, seeking to be completely, again, incognito. He doesn't want to know. This Iranian, Mellon Fellow, takes up the Yoga-Vasistha, translates it himself, writes commentary on it multiple times. And so he's explicitly tied up with this endeavor, a moment of Muslims, not just South Asian, but even in the Middle Eastern context, just catching on to this Hindu text, which is a bestseller. Mughal South was the most difficult choice to justify, because again, he never explicitly but I thought, maybe the weakest part of the book, but I thought he was just so representative of the kind of Sufi technical thought, which has numerous varieties. There are varieties of this one that you mentioned, which give the impression of being more tolerant than they actually are, and actually end up domesticating thought completely to Islamic assumptions, Islamic norms. If I could ask you just to go to the next slide. So before you go, here you see an example of what may look like very much an Islamic domestication of Hindu texts, right? Some stuffing Hindu thought into Islamic expectations, the names of God, manifestations, tajalliyat, calling them books, kitab, the expectation that every religion has a revealed book. These are all very Islamic expectations, aren't they? Remolding Hinduism in a kind of quasi-Orientalist way into Islamic terms. If you go to the next slide, this is part of the reason I love this translation so much. Thank you. Don't have to read all this, but I'll just keep it up on the screen for you. The very next passage, where they're describing the idea of the 4 yugas, the 4 cosmic ages, 6 full cosmic ages of standard Hindu cosmology. It's actually a pretty good translation, pretty accurate, reliable, and it of course rubs against Islamic norms in 100 different ways, and then almost more in a way that I think creates more obscurity than clarity. They just name drop. So pralaya, reabsorption, the disappearance of everything back into Vishnu at the end of a given cycle. They just drop a little gloss there, like the day of resurrection. This is nothing like the day of resurrection. This makes no sense, right? And so immediately after that, very domesticating moment, very next passage is one where they almost, the Muslims, and they're almost willingly aliens, but drops this little drop. It's like our teaching of the day of resurrection. And in the sort of poetic commentary that you find throughout these translations, there's one motif that appears prominently. It's kind of like you either see it or you don't. You're either too mired in the external particular forms of things, you can't get anything behind it. If you can't see it, I got nothing to say. But if you see it, so there's almost this translation practice of dropping comparison points and saying if you have the right insight, you'll get one. And if you don't, you can't really do it plain. I think a kind of presumption of a philosophical cultivation, kind of not of a kind of deep knowledge that's different from bookish knowledge. That's the thing. And just go back to Jiva.
Yes, for a second, and then I'd like to just the last chapter, but yeah, about Jiva.
So very quickly, it's hard to talk about it without getting too deep into the weeds. Jiva is the core of what I think, the sort of Sanskrit slice that I try to repeat. The Sanskrit jet stream contributing to the translation. Yeah, just as you said, Jiva has always been a hot topic in Sanskrit intellectual history. It remains so. The Yoga-Vasistha in the hands of someone like Saraswati, that's the main question. What is a jiva? What is a soul? What is an individual self? And I won't get too deep in the weeds. We don't have so much time. But basically, Yoga-Vasistha has all these standard lists of terms that always occur. Jiva, soul, is listed countless times alongside manas, mind, chitta, also mind, or intellect, buddhi, intellect, ahankara, ego, spirituality. Standard list appears dozens of times. In the Persian text, manas, chitta, buddhi, ahankara, those are all transliterated into Persian. Jiva almost something weird is going on with it. As you said, the Sanskrit term is just not there. And as I scrutinize the cases of it, speaking of the pulling my hair out for hours that I referenced earlier, I couldn't see any rhyme or reason for why that decision was coming from the Muslim side. I couldn't think of any anxiety, any particular reason that might have led to that choice. I think it's coming from the pundits. Madhusudana, brilliant fashion, interpreter of the Yoga-Vasistha, he lays out different theories of the Jiva, and he expresses his own preference. I think that the Sanskrit pundit translators are on his side. I think that they think he's right. And so when the Yoga-Vasistha is mentioned in Jiva, sometimes it means the Madhusudana is sometimes it means other. Yeah. I think the translators they're exerting their own philosophical preference and saying, I'm not going to call that incorrect. That's incorrect. And so they erase the sound. Call it judgment. And then the moments of the text where the Sudana's notion play, those are the moments. Interesting.
was a lot of but that's very
Okay, I have a few more comments, and I'm gonna slowly have these comments. This last comment, well, I'm getting to the last comment, will sort of help to open it up to the audience. But we're talking about, we're dealing here, obviously with translation, we're talking about it, and translation requires conceptual. You sort of outline how these figures were really contending with really complex idea historically. And as a translator, you're forced to constantly think outside of the box. In the history of translation, there is always a starting language, conceptual structure, some notion of shared human inquiry, whether it's toward the divine or in our quest to think through a philosophical context. It's all kind of present in the book. There are moments in the translation process where there is already acceptance of certain logical theoretical ideas, attention, a rejection of foreign ideas. So it's like you are mapping out all of these aspects, sort of trying to suss out all of the dynamics of translation. Right? We just don't get a translated text. There's so much more than that. And I think the question I wanted to ask, I've already asked, but I want to move this central theme of translation of language, right, of networks, Latour, you mentioned in the introduction. There's so much that happens, right, the conversations that are happening to have this, to lead up to this translational moment. And then you sort of take us through the book, and then you end with, how it is at this moment, this translational process is sort of a case study in which we think about, sort of holds the keys to think about cross-cultural dialogue, translation of ideas and texts. And so I have two maybe final questions, and open it up and add on. But one, I wanted to remind you, and you might have read this, or others might have read this. In 2016, Jay Garfield and Brian and Morgan wrote an article in the New York Times, a section called "Philosophy Won't Diversify." Let's call it what it really is. And they really are arguing for two things: the need for the study of non-Western philosophy, and the fact that this cultural environment of America kind of calls for this kind of cultural dialogue. And also the recognition of our presuppositions of Western thought, and how actually these philosophies are Western philosophy, not just philosophy. And they notice across the 118 doctoral programs that only 10% of specialists in Chinese philosophy, 15% have any regular members teaching, have any regular faculty members teaching non-Western philosophy. And so they see non-European philosophical traditions offering distinctive solutions to problems discussed in European philosophy. That they raise the frame of the problems not addressed in European traditions, or emphasize and discuss deeply philosophical problems that are marginalized in European philosophy. And so they look to pre-modern Europe. You mentioned St. Thomas Aquinas, but he recognized this following his colleagues of Aristotle in Arabic, thus broadening his own curriculum courses at that time. So, you at the end of the book talk about the difficulties, the problems that we have in the study of religion. And I'm wondering if there's something, if you were in conversation with Jay Garfield, and also there was a book that came out of it, Brian, Taking Back Philosophy, a multicultural manifesto. And this book came out of sort of the retort to that article in the New York Times, where they said, well, really to understand European, non-European thought, you have to understand the language. How can you discuss the text and understand the language? That in fact, these traditions don't have a rational frame of thought, And that really is the only European thought that can provide this rational discursive language that we can begin this discussion. And you do address that in the end of the book. And so instead of rehashing what you say, I'm wondering if you can now, as the author of the book, sort of take sort of this critical message and maybe think about how you would, or maybe we can all think about how we would respond to J. Garfield. And maybe in defense and sort of sussing out these core arguments that they made it to. They received a lot of backlash. And there was a graduate program, I think, at which university that tried to have a conference on non-Western philosophies, and then the faculty came to that. And then I also want to add in there that there's another conversation that you're having, and that there's a tendency of all kind of intellectual discourse as political, right? An outcome of empirical transaction that's happening. And Audrey Tuschke writes about this in her book. And you sort of, in your book, come back and say, well, there is this interest, or this real engagement with Sapiential knowledge, defines Sapiential knowledge in a particular way, which to me feels also like a direct outcome of the text that you're looking at. So yeah, so there's sort of two, sorry about that. There's sort of two separate questions, but I think the main sort of overriding concern is how have you thought, I mean, you describe it in the last chapter, and you've been thinking about this after you finished writing the book, the ways in which this particular case study really has the material to think about this concept. Where do we place this discussion? Can it relate to the man of the Department of Philosophy? Should philosophy of religion be this or this? Is it really an issue? Okay.
No, open up.
Well, you know, it's like trying to simplify your work is really difficult. It's challenging.
You should kind of,
Yeah.
you know, take responses from students, and those of you on Zoom, Christina, Geeta, Nirvana, Rick, Barry, I'll just keep track if there's a hand up there. So let's try and open up this conversation because it resonates. As Shankar spoke in the first part of the talk about what the kind of experimental space, even this institute space, began as a kind of an experimental space and thinking the global humanity. What does it mean? Is it the kind of neoliberal model of humanities, or do more and more and more, but don't actually really consider the shifting ground of disciplines, really unearth all assumptions, excavate assumptions, or is it about just adding more? And so it's a conversation that resonates with the kind of work that's been happening in the humanities broadly, while staying with a kind of a liberal pluralism at the same time. So there is this deep tension, you know, and so yeah. The comments, questions from both on Shankar's work. Yes, Amita.
Well, I heard a long time ago, this very much, but maybe some of this radical structural transformation of the human.
Oh, God. Just.
But I was more seriously, which is just any sense about any sense of the initiation of this process. You know, in the beginning, we were talking about how some self-fashion. So it's not necessarily but because I'm sure it's quite possible that the states or the different of that, but just that's me to do with that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and don't get me wrong. As much as I'm trying to complicate the story, the motivations that gave life to this translation. The imperial is undeniably one of them. Undeniable. That's the earliest translations of Bharata, for example, on Krishna, and great work on this. You can see in the language, right? There's referring to these as tones of history. There's all basically explicit goal of I want to learn the history of these people. Learning the history of the people that I'm going to move. I need to know them to look them up. What I'm trying to complicate is simply to say that, including among the young people, famously have very high belief in talk, spiritual practitioners. So I think we can simultaneously think about taking those sorts of things as well, part of the story. There are more actors at play. Right? Actual translators, marginal commentaries, and stray comments we have from courtiers, expressing theological opinions about the project. But there's a multitude of actors that feel currently or just for other reasons, and so part of my goal is to recover that complexity. So, opening of the Mahabharata, the first translations explicitly funded for imperial purposes. You look at the rhetoric and the introduction, the language that they use. It's theological. So that motivation is on the radar. Simultaneously.
I'm not really also something relevant.
That is a great question. Part of my continuing interest, as you can see, right, I feel like the field is focused on the courts, emperors, and just everything else. Once funding, so to speak, this modern window dries up, translations are deposed, it's not politically smart for them to continue patronizing them. These translations continue. They happen in little zawias, little dabkas, right? Not the places. They happen out in the field where students are meeting yoga and writing treatises, learning each other's practices. Yeah, there's a wide variety of that. Of course, it's very frustrating that we often lack the archive. Part of the reason I was so compelled to do this is there's an Iranian on this too. This man primarily known as an Iranian. He's Yoga-Vasistha back there. And there's clearly an edge to his translation, his commentary, where he's pointing a finger at the Safavids, which is a pretty oppressive empire at this point, and it's working doggedly to sort of make a historically city place cheap, do it in a heavy-handed way, sort of ideologically. He's pointing a nose and saying a finger and saying there's wisdom to be found. Well, even in India, the leading site perhaps seek knowledge. There's a Iranian audience and a whole number of different motivations for the initiative. I can come back to this question.
Yes.
Unless there's somebody who can speak.
I'm sorry, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so the conundrums of me as a translator. I'm so disappointed. The corners I end up getting. Since so much of the points I'm trying to make about this translation depend upon side-by-side translation. Looking at the Sanskrit alongside the Persian, but in English. I ended up feeling forced to resort to a quote-unquote literal mode of translation, where the word order, even things like that, it's pretty blocky, it's pretty chunky, it's not an elegant English, and so it kind of saps all the liberatiness out of these texts. For my purposes in this book, I felt justified, just for the particular argument. But it's deeply unsatisfactory. For future work, I very much want to try to literary, which which I think is really first and foremost on the translated one. And it's also tied up with this spiritual. Literarily, the Persian could not be more different. Completely different styles and prose and literary imagery. I'm trying to repeat that kind of thing while pursuing that kind of philosophical thing. I tried. I just couldn't do it.
I really feel you. It's, hinge on the also Shankar. This comes back to the thought I have, which relates to your translation, is that there's this whole literary aspect. And you're looking at a particular genre of text, and we know how intertextual genres are. And then you have this intertextual aspect, like so from the Jain perspective, from Jain studies perspective, and also thinking about genre and how it's used by minority traditions to make themselves known to majority traditions out there. They really used a wide range of texts to make philosophical arguments. And so my thought, and I wonder if this is something for the next project, because translation is such a messy thing. You know, you're dealing with all these contexts, but then you have these references, you know, and you have other genres like stotras and hymn that can be philosophical, and that we know from, for example, James were recited in Sanskrit to Persian to the Mughal authors. So it would be an interesting, I'll be interested to see what other texts are brought to bear on these types of projects. You know, what other texts are thinking of where these intellectual influences are
I had that line of thought that actually connects directly to the philosophy question. I'm all for what he's doing. All for it. We need more of it. J. Garfield, you know, better than perhaps anybody else. Pursuing what you would think is a low bar, but is surprisingly not. To convince philosophy departments, Europhone philosophy departments at large, that non-European civilizations can have a thought. They have thoughts. They have reason. They have rationality. It's hard. It's actually hard to get that recognition. And so I'm all for the way that J. Garfield is doing it, and I don't want to interrupt it. Because he's done as much as anybody else to foster that recognition. Quietly, I'll say that my fear. J. Garfield's more aware of this than most, but many of the most successful examples of this kind of endeavor, in my view, over domesticate Islamic philosophical traditions, Sanskrit, Hindu philosophical traditions, to the terms of philosophy department that we know. It accepts that mode of inquiry largely untroubled. And this plugs Sanskrit out into it. Will often pursue the most dialectically sophisticated rigorous stuff to just dazzle them with the rational acuity of the text. I think you just kind of need that kind of assault. Finally convince the world of philosophy departments that there's real rigorous rational thought elsewhere. But to your point, every one of these thinkers that I deal with in this book, as I mentioned, the card-carrying, dialectical, rational, argumentative philosophers in some of their treatises, they all write code. They all pursue literature. They all have interest in aesthetics and literary experience. So what they would call philosophy, there's not that validation. And so rationality, rational discourse unto itself is thoroughly another kind of more holistic knowing, imaginative poetic knowing that is complementary, if not essential to the kind of knowledge that rational.
Do you think that sapiential, what you call sapiential knowledge, is a very hard to engage with Western philosophy? Because they're worried about the positivity of metaphysics, a positive metaphysics, one that would assert an absolute perspective, and that there may be something to that.
Yeah, it's one of the big obstacles. And so my ideal scenario would be one of the very presumptions and terms and modes of debate that uses radically to accept the way that other cultures do it. But if it's done the way J. Garfield is after, that would itself be huge. Better done.
You know, Shankar and Lynna, institutionally speaking, for the past 5 years, whether our individual faculty members know about it or not, there was a very active conversation about generating a more comparativist model, institutional through disciplines. And there was a push, not so much comparative, it didn't begin with comparative, not talking about one it's not there, but thinking through an experiment where, say, if you think of a department of comparative literature, instead, there too there are these bifurcations. You know, the non-Western literary traditions they go into area studies, and then you have these literature departments, French and Spanish and so on. Interestingly, when the dean brought up the question of training the next generation of students in this comparative mode, so there are no silos in that sense. The strongest pushback came from the language departments. They refused to participate in that comparative. It was not the other way around.
Not surprised.
And their point was that, oh, but students do need to be rigorously trained in this one particular language.
They don't want to be friends.
Translated and also, but if you don't have a department of comparative, it's just one example. Then what happens is you rarely have an intake of students who would train in the way, like your training is really the exception rather than they would train in maybe 2 or 3 European languages, but training across, you know, so someone doing French and German, and then training in Arabic, unless you're around it, Richie, you know what I mean? That it's so rare. So unless the institutional structures are completely changed, but then the change has to come ground up as well. And so there is such a stigma about doing things in translation, studying translated texts, that is a real barrier in the humanities.
Right.
And it's just a general point I'm making, that even this institution did try to rethink the humanities in certain other. When we had the dean come in for his first term, because the question of what constitutes global, it emerged from that, and then many of us humanists pushed back against a certain homogenizing idea of global, saying that don't kind of reduce us to thinking the space-time of global capital. Just that, because there are these global energies that go back to the modern world, there are these exchanges. So think in the long duration. Don't think of only our time. So just to put it in the mix of these conversations, that they happen, but they eventually just come up as, you know, ephemeral experimental spaces. So like you could have a 1-year lab or something where scholars, you know, come together, talk to each other, even read text from that they would not read.
Or the interdepartmental fellow.
Or the interdepartmental.
One, you know,
Interdepartmental.
I remember with Domship.
In my lifetime, I don't see a philosophy department that would incorporate what you talk about. I don't see that happen.
It's interesting. It's also a student. Really interesting. Projects where you're interacting with languages. You come up across the requirements of each part. At Yale, you have to learn French, German, but have to learn Sanskrit for Domship. I need Hindi to translate. Can I please let go of German? No, I can't. Earlier, and then I have to speak on all of them. But at least in some institutions, I've noticed that students keep coming with the picture. You know, they realize that this is a deficiency. We need to create systems that allow for the student to have a advisorial group that can handle this kind of project. But it's interesting because I feel like, I don't know if you felt that as a student at Harvard, with this type of project, you have to kind of figure out who can support this project. It's always interesting. So it would be nice maybe in the next round if we had, I don't know, you know, in America, they don't have translation. They don't have a translation discipline where you might, but they have that around the world. And I wonder if that would help with all the anxiety. Yeah. I don't know. I do have a critique also.
Oh no.
And it
We're out of time.
talking about, and it's not really a critique, it's just again the next step is thinking, or you probably already thought about a focused fixed thing. And so talking about using non-Western. I thought it was interesting that your metaphor of jet streams is your primary metaphor, but that in the course of reading your book, there were other indigenous metaphors and also to South Asia. And so, this comes back to an idea I thought about, really the importance of metaphors, conveying knowledge, and upama, similes. These are important modes of knowledge. And in fact, in some groups, religious groups, some philosophers, the primary. And so you really use that metaphor to carry us through the book. And I'm just wondering, that is a metaphor external to the traditions. So is there an attempt to go back? Would there be internal metaphor or deriving from active translation that you're trying to translate, that maybe that's carries the point of internal logic of these traditions?
Thank you. I'll just quickly say to the John, what do we have to back up for?
I mean, you can respond. It's just our lunch is getting cold.
It's upama. Yeah.
I'll quickly say to Johnny's point that I think the context I was creating this book, it speaks to the same concern. Again, the jet stream, the silos, they need to be there. They need to be there. That learning, that training was the conditions that made possible particular confluence that's there. It would have been deeply impoverished without this. But you do find the same attitudes in the silos that 98% of the people who are brought up in those curricula in those world, they're going to stay in their silos. They can stay, they should stay. They will defend their silos, and they will defend the exclusivist tenor of their silos. Part of what I try to do in the book is not only to explain how the conversations are facilitated, but also the multitude of reasons that they have their own internal logic that's completely ignoring, which we usually, with liberal impulses, have an aversion to. How could they be so close-minded, right? And how could they be so conservative? But they have their own reasons